So I'm Gilbert Lensen, I'm the president of ABIS, and I'm a professor in executive education at INSEAD and Rotterdam. To my left is Nigel Room from Vlerick Business School, who played a major role in the research that we are discussing today. In the middle is Jeremy Moon, a Nottingham University Business School, who designed a conceptual framework for the research program. And Dominic Zobjak, who is Scientific Officer, DG Research and Innovation, who has been at the origin of FP7 and the program that has led to this type of research. So we're going to do the following. The subject is CSR and Corporate Impact Assessment in Management and Social Sciences Research and Education. So this is about the future of research. What do we learn from this research in terms of the research of CSR, or should we call it the research in business and society? But there's two types of research, or two rounds. One is from a business relevance point of view. Secondly, from a policy relevance point of view, and then we'll end up with some comments on education and management development. Now, there's some summary statements about the research, and so the first round will be on the future of CSR research from a business relevance perspective. And I read you some of the conclusions, just as a refresher, from yesterday. The research suggests that when aggregated, CSR activities as defined and practiced in the last 10-15 years have not made a significant contribution to addressing major objectives and challenges, social and environmental challenges in Europe. Have not made a significant contribution. CSR activities, that was it. Second, impact-type thinking is relatively poorly developed in business, except in relation to the economic outcomes of the firm, and CSR impacts are no different. Another statement, impacts that are directly attributable to what might be called CSR practice or follow from the work of CSR departments seem relatively minor compared to the overall social and environmental impact of the company on society. And lastly, the research suggests that companies regard CSR practice as a necessity, and yet they have a fairly uneven view of what CSR involves, or what somebody said yesterday, they accept CSR and they accept the fact that there is a CSR department, but really don't care what the CSR department is doing, which might be an exaggeration, but that was a quote from yesterday. So, I mean, it's a quite significant research, piece of research that we have on the table here, which should, be, shocking to all of us. In the field of CSR. And if you listen very carefully to what the Volkswagen guy said yesterday, basically most business consider CSR as a cost of doing business. It's accepted, everybody does it, not doing it is stupid, so you do it, you have a CSR department, but it's a cost of doing business. And of course the Volkswagen guy said, don't yet invent another reporting, requirements, because it adds to the cost of business. Yet, from my observation, a lot of innovation in business is taking place, the whole shifting of business portfolios to more sustainable products, to more sustainable business models is taking place. And yet that is not under the heading of CSR, which is reflected in one of the comments here, the impacts that businesses have on society through the way they reposition themselves in the geopolitical division of labor with the rise of the BRICS and so on, is not the subject, has not been the subject of research because it's not seen as part of CSR. Anyway, let me start with Nigel Room. So what does this mean for the future of research from a business relevant point of view?
Gilbert, thank you. I want to repeat something that I said yesterday. I distinguish between knowledge and know-how. And I said as a business academic. I'm interested in knowledge and know-how. Knowing how to do things as well as knowing things. And I have to say, I like to study how to do things. And that's going to color what I'm going to say to you. The emergence of the idea of impact over the last 5 years and into the future reminds me of environmental reporting in the early 1990s. It's an emergent phenomena, and I'm going to assure you that an increasing number of potential PhD students will come to you to talk about studying this emergent phenomena, and as they do so, they'll discover it's quite difficult to find examples of it, and they'll be challenged. But after 10 years, there'll be more examples. So this is the nature of emergent phenomena. And I just remind you that it's exactly the same as with environmental reporting, the emergence of environmental management systems, and so on. I'm talking about things in your territory, right? There is a bigger issue. So support your research students, advise them not to study impacts until they're better developed. I think there's a bigger phenomena here, which is the idea that the moment that CSR issues become strategic, they become part of company strategy. And I'm confused about whether I'm a professor of corporate responsibility and sustainable development or whether I'm a professor of strategy. But I work with exciting companies that are doing the type of work that Gilbert talks about. They're seeing social and environmental changes as a basis for reformulating what they do, because they say what we do is not going to endure into the future. We need to make some kind of change in our business models, our way of thinking. We still make money, we're still business focused, but it's how we make that profit that is going to matter. Now, the difference between that and studying impact is impact can be studied from a CSR viewpoint. Studying whole organizational transformation, which leads to new business models, new relationships with partners, new relationships with customers. This is highly strategic. It's whole company, so it's cross-functional. So I'm sorry, academics, it's cross-disciplinary, right? There aren't convenient theories because theories come out of disciplines. It's highly innovative. It's about how to undertake learning and change, leading to innovation. Learning and innovation leading to change. So if you're going to study that, and I think that area is going to become far more critical in the next 10 years than it has been. It's been talked about in the last 20 years since the Brundtland report, but it hasn't been practiced, and more companies are beginning to seize on it. If you're going to study that from a research viewpoint, you're going to have to reconfigure the way you understand research. And the trouble with that is that we are all constrained as academics by the publishing systems that we have to submit our papers to, that they have to be conveniently small scale, they have to be conveniently theoretically or disciplinarily informed. And I am told just a moment ago that I had less than a minute. I'll tell you a little story. I was accused by a French business ethicist that a paper that I wrote recently was managerialist, to which my reply was, why do you use that as such a term of abuse? I teach in a business school. I teach managers, so my work is by definition about management practice. It's about know-how as much as about knowledge. So I think that we need much more emphasis on the development of know-how and research into know-how, and I'll return to that when I have another 4 minutes to talk about education.
Okay, Jeremy, on the business relevance of future CSR research.
As always, I start in the past, somewhat echoing one of Nigel's observations, and this is the good news for those of us who are trying to think about impact in the context of CSR, that the CSR research themes are continually emergent and re-emergent. And cheeringly, some of our forerunners have thought about some of these things. The idea of CSR responsiveness implied better connection with the society. Likewise, Donna Wood's idea of CS performance, although she bundled what we distinguish as performance and impact. But I think also there's a sort of another fundamental change which is relevant to CSR impact and its assessment and measurement. And that is the shift from CSR as something that corporations define and produce. An idea in the 60s, to caricature a little bit, is that companies decided what their corporate social responsibilities were and had some outputs which they could report and boast a little bit about. Corporate social responsibility has moved from being corporate-centred to being corporate-oriented. In other words, it's the sphere of the corporation which is now judged by the society. And it's not just outputs, to repeat, it is the sphere of the corporation, not just what the corporation defines as its social outputs and impacts. This has been described by the British socio-legal theorist Doreen McBarnett as the new corporate accountability. Some of the implications of this are hard when it comes to thinking about assessing our impact. Instead of companies being subject to a sort of vague social gaze and periodic events, like sit-ins, boycotts and the like, corporations are now subject to a much more continuing and close and critical gaze. The CSR is defined by others, not just the corporations. Some of these partners can be critical, always critical, maybe Greenpeace for the most part falls into that category. But in other cases, they're willing partners because they also have an interest in improving and ameliorating some of the negative impacts of corporations and expanding the positive ones. Thus, corporate social responsibility, is defined as multi-stakeholder and the like, but I just really wanted to invert, if you like, a conventional understanding about it. It's not defined by corporations anymore. That makes in some ways it harder, but in some ways it makes it easier or more of a challenge to undertake, because some of these partners, although they might be light in organisational and financial resources, they actually often bring greater expertise in the spheres in which corporations have an impact, be it on climate, wastes, human rights, poverty, health and safety. Thank you. So I think research agendas need to reflect this reality, and it goes also with the sort of idea of co-production, which was mentioned yesterday in the Unilever case. Unilever packages washing powders. Does it claim the responsibility for diminished impacts of these in our water systems, or to the machine manufacturers, or to the consumers? So I think research needs to be broader, but it needs to take advantage of some of these institutions that go with the new CSR, and these are partnerships and standards. And I believe that actually one can derive implied impact measures simply by through membership of something like an ethical trade system or a fair trade system. And because these actually set standards which are loosely policed, minimum wages, health and safety conditions, and at least some impacts can be derived from membership of some of these partnerships. And I think more generally, the biggest challenge, I think, is to think more about the value that companies bring, and to think at the point of response and strategy, not just when it comes to the implementation. Sorry, I can't elaborate on that. My time is up.
But you'll have a second and a third chance. Dominic, yesterday we had Quintana Trias pointing out the future of EU support research within the framework of Europe 2020. I heard a lot of advances in making research more business relevant in terms of interdisciplinary problem focused and so on. Maybe you want to elaborate a little bit on that in terms of the future of research and the kind of research you want to support in the future that has true business relevance.
Sure, with pleasure. Gilbert. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'll actually start on a personal note. Congratulations to the Impact Consortium for getting that far and for having the project done until the end. and for this final conference. It's a particular pleasure for me as I've been following this project since the conception of the research topic to which it responded. So it's a particular honor and pleasure to actually hear now all the results that have come out of that. Now back to your question, Gilbert. I think, well, first of all, I would like to consider a little bit a historical perspective before I get to Horizon 2020, because it's important to understand that at the European level, we have a history right now of pretty much a decade of funding CSR or CSR relevant research. And I think that from the very beginning, when we started developing a research agenda in the area of CSR, we've continuously tried to challenge researchers to be business relevant and to work directly with business. First, in the first stage, we had more pioneering research to see how it can be done, what could be the main issues that would emerge. Then, following up on that, we saw that maybe it's worthwhile to actually have a look at the impacts of corporate social responsibility, and this is this particular research project that addressed this issue. But since then, we have also gone even further. This year, we've had a research topic that focused actually already on the broader impacts of companies, of business, on society. So it goes beyond the CSR and CSR policy. It speaks about the broader picture. So we expect that this research will step up, in particular the work on impact measurement of company operations, in particular in this area, in particular in the development context, to link it to the Millennium Development Goals. But I think that the frameworks that will be developed within the research projects that are funded would be applicable not only to the development context. And we are going to start those projects early next year, so this is really something which is right now in the making. We finalize all the discussions on that, and this research will basically start at the point where impact finishes, I think, to a large extent. Now, to Horizon 2020. Horizon 2020, I think, will bring this whole issue even further. And this is exactly, the reason for this is exactly what you said and what Director Quintana mentioned yesterday, that Horizon 2020 is designed as a whole program to be much more impact-driven and provide much more space for action research with direct implications that could be directly implemented, with a lot of interactions with stakeholders and with direct engagement with stakeholders of all kinds. And this is an overarching idea for the entire framework program for the next 7 years, with a substantial funding, with a focus on societal challenges. So we go beyond disciplinary thinking. We focus on what are the major issues that are there to be addressed in the society, and we would like everyone to come together to try to address those challenges. So it will be, we hope it will be less academic, we hope it will be more practical, we hope it also will be more focused on solving real problems in the society.
Okay, at this stage I would like to open up the debate with you in the room, because otherwise we come at the end and I'm going to ask you, do you have any questions? And then there are 1 or 2 questions, that's not dynamic. So this is not about questions, this is about your view on the future of research from a business relevant point of view. So I don't know where the business representatives are, but even if you're not a business representative, maybe at this time I should refer to the chair of our business board, Michel Bonde, who has some explicit views on the future, who is quite critical also about the research. So what do you think is the future of research from a business relevant point of view? Because you had I heard some doubts yesterday from you.
Yes, I discussed with you and with different person the fact that I'm doubting concerning the impact research, could I say impact? Because what is interesting for a business is to measure and after that to manage, because it's impossible without you know that. And in practice, I think that the target was wrongly fixed, because the corporate societal impact is really difficult to be defined. As I explained yesterday, you could measure the product impact, you could measure a plant impact. Cooperation, why not? But I don't see how is it possible to consolidate it the product, and for instance, the fact that we are sharing plans and many plans with other companies, and not 1, 2, 10, and so on, or to add apples and pears, and after that we have an indicator. So I think that the research now has to be really pragmatic and to fix, taking into account the company, could I say, it's a difference between automotive and construction, and seeing that to select a limited number of key factors and to choose at what level we will consider this key factor. I think that if research could give us certain of this element, it will be useful for the business. If not, okay, it's interesting, it's an interesting concept and we could discuss and so on, but okay, I don't see the interest for the business guys. We need to measure, we need to have indicator, clear indicator, and to see their evolution and to take certain measure, taking into account the result of this indicator. Thanks.
So what you're saying is the level of analysis of the research needs to be reconsidered.
Yes.
Not at the company level,
No.
but at, for instance, as you mentioned yesterday also, we are in the port of Antwerp, which is only 40 kilometers from here. We share the port of Antwerp facilities with other chemical companies, with oil companies, with transport companies. You can measure the impact of the air quality in Antwerp from the industrial cluster in Antwerp, but not the specific, it's very difficult to measure the specific impact of Solvay in Antwerp. But you can, if you take the level of analysis of that regional level or that city level, where a lot of companies can work together to reduce negative impacts and increase positive impacts. Is that what that is a central point, I think?
Yes, really. That is, for instance, Port of Antwerp is a good example. Port of Houston could be also analyzed for the chemical sector. That is interesting. Okay, I stop there.
Okay, very good. I first go to Regina and then here to our friends from Harvard.
Yes, I would like to reply to the comment just made. And I agree that for the chemical sector, which was not one of the 5 sectors that we concentrated on, there are certain additional or specific challenges like in any sector. I think any sector has its own challenges on how can you measure certain things. And I don't think there's a disagreement because you're absolutely right that if we look at corporate impact, there can be cases where a company, the most important impact to look at would be coming from the product. And there are other sectors or companies where maybe operations at a certain site or other effects are more important. And the research does not suggest, and we do not suggest that there should be an overall assessment of every thinkable impact that a company has, because it's impossible. It's too expensive, it takes too long, it doesn't help anyone. It's about looking for relevance. What are the main pressures? Where are the main levers for positive or negative impacts that a company can control or can change by management decisions? And that is different from saying we need to do an overall assessment. So I do think you're absolutely raising the right points, and I also think that we have to acknowledge that it is not only, I mean, we can't expect that companies measure or assess their impact. We can hope that they try to manage their impacts in a way that they consciously see what are relevant impacts and how can they increase or decrease them depending whether they are positive or negative. But it's not, I mean, it doesn't pay off in the sense of business case. So we also have to see that if we want to know more about corporate impacts, we also have to have public people that maybe assess reports that are there anyway, and so on. So I think that the question also of what is research targeted at businesses or in business interest, that is one important question, but it's also about what do we have, what kind of research do we need in order, from a public perspective, in order to know more about corporate impacts.
Right. I mean, I think it is very important that to consider, because you had a lot of pushback yesterday, right? About this research. Every research that you're doing is resulting in us having to report more. And it is a burden on us, and you know, and we might say, well, corporations need to be accountable, they need to be transparent and so on, but the question is that the right way to go? Is that the right kind of research we want to be producing? So that's also an effect, but I want to come back to a number of other dimensions, but give you the word first, sir. Microphone, please.
We still have a tendency to take the angle of the company and to, I've seen even in some papers, you know, trying to still link desperately this causality between business and CSR. So, you know, really stopping this is one step. A second step would be to develop some innovative business models that are coming from the social sector. In other words, involving stakeholders. Research should involve stakeholders directly, and I mean by that unions, non-profit organizations, hybrid models where you see basically governance models where the decision-making within the company is not really developed by shareholders only, but also by stakeholders. Because that's going to be the new model going forward. I don't think the classical model as we know it, the capitalist model, can stay. And academics can play a role here. Typically, we've been trailing companies here, and I think the way to be ahead of companies is to say, I think there's another model out there that is not the business model. And I think we can give you some direction. And I'm not saying that all of these things are going to be perfect, because it is really trying very hard to change the model. The current model is not working. It is not working. And so we have some initial ideas of, you know, we're going to talk about cooperatives, I think a bit later. We're going to talk about other business models where I think stakeholders can have more say in how the company is going to evolve. And if we go in that direction, I think there is more promising, innovative research that can come out.
Okay.
And so that I think that's a really important point. And we've you know, with Porter have not, you know, done justice to this, because we've looked at win-win, and I think we need to step away from that.
Sorry, say that again.
We need to step away from that. We need to find ways where we identify conflict, where, you know, unions can point us to this, employees can point us to this, the public opinion, and that research is hard to conduct because
Okay.
You know, stakeholders are hard to hear.
Yeah. Yes, please. Hand over the microphone, please.
I was thinking about measuring impact. The academic role could also be to research to what extent different parameters in impact are related to each other. I'm thinking about the concept of Human Development Index that has been developed by Amartya Sen, and human development is also a very complex concept. But Amartya Sen brought it back to only 3 elements: educational level, life expectancy, and income per capita. And why is that? Well, because many other indicators are related to these 3. So could be an agenda for future research is to research in what extent we can bring back the number of indicators that capture most of the social impact, and in such a way that it's also feasible to measure by companies. So let's suppose, take for example, I can imagine that energy consumption is something that companies can measure quite well, whereas that could be a very important indicator for many other effects as well.
Okay.
So in this way, there could be a practical way of implementing the agenda.
Okay. Any other comments, additions? Okay, before I go back to the panel, each few seconds. I think what we also need to address is, which was also in some of these comments. Yes, if you look at what is defined as CSR by companies, impact is few and little, few and far between. We have to recognize that. However, the big sustainability transformations take place not under the heading of CSR. If you look at what IBM is doing, what Unilever is doing, what General Electric is doing, what Umicore are doing, they're transforming their whole business models, right? Their whole portfolio. But that has nothing to do with the activities of the CSR department. Some of them haven't even got a CSR department. The impact there, positive impact, is saved in the business transformation of IBM and its smart planet business model is enormous. But yet, that is not subject of CSR, a CSR strategy. Businesses do this because they see the need to address environmental, social issues, develop business models around that. But CSR, that's not CSR in their point of view. And it relates to my experience with executives. Talk to them about CSR, they immediately say, we have a CSR department for that. Talk to them, right? If you say, how are you building a sustainable business for the future, then they get interested. But they see that as quite divorced from CSR. Now, we are theorizing about this and, of course, and saying, no, it is not, and it is integrated, and so on and so forth. But it's just not on the radar screen in business. They have a different agenda now. And in many ways, I must say, in my experience with executives, CSR is a turn-off for them. It just turns them off. It is not inspiring them. It is all about reporting, compliance, and so on. And you say, well, you have to strategize it. Well, I say, yeah, but that's not where we start from. And by the way, talk to my CSR director. Okay, any comments from the audience?
I'd like to respond to Michel and to take up that point. There are two debates going on around this reporting of this project. There's the one which is, what is the future of research on impacts? What does this study mean for that? And then there's another one which is the future is going to be fundamentally different because what was called CSR in the past is increasingly going to become strategic. Now, I want to go back to Michel's point because I think there's a misunderstanding of the origins of this research. The origins of the research that we've just completed, which is different from what it finds. The origins were, you have a company. The company faces pressures. Those pressures are understood by the CSR department. The CSR department does something that changes the impacts of the company. The research originated in that. What is the change of impact that comes out of the activities called CSR? Not what are the impacts of the company, but what are the impacts of the CSR activities of the company? Mm-hmm. And one of the things that we found was that the impacts of the company are probably much bigger than the impacts of the CSR department. Right?
What does that mean for research then?
Well, no, but what it means is that part of Michel was talking about what are the impacts that you're looking at? Is it the product? Is it the interactions? No, we were trying to trace. I, as the CSR manager, have some money to do something. Yeah. What are its impacts?
Okay, that is the research done.
Not what are the impacts of the company.
But what is the implication for future research then?
Well, the implications are that if you want, from our study, we discovered it's enormously difficult, but it nevertheless has to be attempted to trace the relationship between what you do and its consequences. But I have to tell you, we live in a world where we mostly do not know the consequences of what we do. So I'll translate that back into what does that mean for business? Business doesn't know the consequences of what it does. That's a very strange world when we talk about sustainability being informed by principles of precaution and anticipation, which are all about consequences.
How do you research that? Microphone, please.
Environmental accounting, okay? What do companies report today? They report financial reports, and if we were rigorous in our environmental accounting, a lot of companies would be close to bankruptcy, let's face it. So reporting, that's where it starts. I think environmental reporting by companies is really below zero. So that would be a research stream, which is probably not much fun because it's accounting. But you know what? It's urgent. It's urgent, why? Because of your point. because these are things that companies are not even aware of. Managers are not even aware of where they stand in resource use, resource allocation, climate change, and all of that.
Good.
So for me, that's an urgent need for accountants, people who can rigorously measure that and report it, okay?
So
where do we stand?
Okay. So what emerges, I come back to you. So what emerges is real impact, research on real impact, but on limited subjects, not on total, yeah, but on, on certain impacts.
It's not so limited. It's a huge area.
Yeah,
it's
but it's
resource
on environment.
allocation, it's climate change. I don't know how many in the room here are concerned about this issue. This is super important,
Good,
and not
okay.
just for Europeans.
The lady in the back, please.
I have difficulties understanding some points you're raising here in the last minutes. You're looking at how does CSR departments impact on business, but in fact I think that this is fundamentally wrong, because CSR should be a way of doing business, and that's also, I prefer in fact for once the Dutch term of CSR, which is maatschappelijk verantwoord ondernemen, so doing business in a socially responsible way. And I think that is what people are now doing. The companies you just mentioned, they understood that message, and their management has indeed changed and are doing business in a socially responsible way. And it's not because you don't have a CSR department that you're not embracing CSR.
So what is the implication for research then, following your assertion?
I see it very difficult to measure the impact of CSR on business, because it should be part of doing business, it being in the business or not being in the business.
It wasn't the impact on business, it was the impact on society.
Yeah.
But can...
Yeah, but what she says it's a change in business, in the way you do business.
Yep.
And of course then immediately is the question, how do you measure that? Because then the answer is it's too complex.
No, but I mean,
it's multi-causal.
That was one of the major, certainly one of the major challenges, but just to make sure that there is no misunderstanding, we did not look at the impact of CSR departments on how to create impact. That was one question, was to look in how far that makes a difference or not. But we, for example, in the SME study, most SMEs don't have any CSR departments, and we still looked at CSR. In the quality of jobs issue, usually that is not in the competence of the CSR department, but rather the human relations department. And all the interviews we had in the companies were also with people from the HR department, with people from the environmental department. So we did not concentrate only on the CSR departments, because we are aware that activities that companies do that go in the old sense of the CSR definition of the European Commission, which we used, beyond compliance, voluntary activities. So we did not say, if you call it CSR, then we will look at it, but rather we look at what you are actually doing and why you're doing it and how you are doing it and what consequences it leads to. And this was the kind of the object of our research.
Yeah,
so I absolutely agree with, with the
But that was not even in the Delphi study,
yes.
Andre? In the Delphi study, how did you research it? Did you ask for CSR activities?
Actually, we even avoided the term CSR. Yeah. Because we saw that when you quoted CSR, then it's attributed to different activities in different sectors. Yeah. For example, in the chemical industry, health, safety, and even responsible care is not attributed as CSR. This is a brand, and CSR is perceived as the other things you could do if you still have time and money. So we asked for, we began with the study based on the old definition, we just asked for voluntary measures. Everything which is more than legal compliance.
We're going to the second round, but of course if you assert that, that is even more depressing. Because if you could say what the impact of what companies do under the heading of CSR is limited, which is the outcome of the research as we understood it, if you now say no, we even enlarged it in the direction of the total impact of the companies too, in a broader way of a sustainable economy and sustainability, the impact is also very limited. That's of course quite depressing. But anyway, let's move on to the Simon. A last comment on, on the business relevance.
I hope it's a bridge from business into the policy space.
Yeah, but then we need to do it
very quickly. We have a lot of difficulties with research, whether or not it's funded by the European Commission or others, to engage companies, despite the strong signals being sent by the Commission that business should be involved. The issues that many companies identify are relevance, materiality, the time it takes, and what kind of outputs can be practically used. I think it's also indicative that only 2 or 3 of the 19 companies that we studied wanted to come to the conference today to hear about the outputs of the research. So, we talk about the future of research and we talk about impact. It seems to me that impact has 2 components. One is the impact of what we have done, and the second is the impact of what we may do in the future. And so the question, which I think is also tied into what Horizon 2020 will support, is should academia and research play a stronger role in working with business to map out the future?
Okay, thank you. Right, let's go on to the second round, which is on the policy relevance. What does this all mean for policy at the European level, but maybe also at other levels? And a few statements from the research. The study suggests that policy support for generic CSR, even when focused on more on impacts, does not on its own replace policies focused on specific target areas, such as the industry level or the regional level, like REACH and ROHS and so on. Meaning, basically, there is more impact that the European Union has on sector-specific and regional-specific initiatives. This is quite interesting, because if you look at what has really started to reform or transform the chemical industry, it's been the REACH framework. The REACH framework, which is a multi-stakeholder, which was not called CSR. It was a multi-stakeholder agreement supported by the EU, and with the involvement of NGOs and the total industry in terms of reducing negative impacts. That has had a big impact in Europe, but it's not under CSR. The other one is, for instance, Vinyl Plus in the PVC industry. Although there, of course, the European Commission let down the industry by not putting import quota and standards on cheap, environmentally unfriendly Chinese product, because the European companies decided to have an agreement amongst them for more sustainable PVC, and yet the European Commission failed to protect them because the Chinese came in and said, we don't care about this agreement because we put cheap, and we know how PVC is one of the most dirty and environmentally polluting products that we know. So this was one. The EU has more impact through such initiatives than through specific than through generic CSR. Another one, where there are networks or clusters of companies and other actors active on CSR and sustainability at a local or an industry level, CSR practice seems to have potential to be more explicit and strategic, which is, basically the first point. And finally, there is a clear opportunity and arguably a need for future EC research and innovation policy to promote development of new conceptual frameworks, methodologies, and instruments. And I think it was also yesterday alluded to, and this morning also by Dominic, that action research, really looking at what companies are really doing across a whole impact scale, is something that is possible now. We need to see how that is being operationalized within the framework program. So I'm going to start with Dominic here on this round on the future of research in this area. I will not call it CSR research anymore. I'll call it the research in this area and sustainability probably, or business and society, from a policy relevant point of view. Dominic.
Thank you, Gilbert. I will first relate to CSR and what you said also about the findings of the impacts, of the real impacts of activities that are labeled as CSR and some others that are not. Well, I think that's I think that the finding is absolutely not a surprise, and I think it's actually very good that it's this way, because of course there is a whole world beyond what we call CSR, and the CSR as the concept, as it was conceived as a concept at the European level, initially was quite restrictive and quite narrow, to add an extra dimension to all the other things that were happening. And I think that after all those activities are about two main things, are about sustainability and are about responsibility. And I think that within also the research agenda, we have tried to develop activities that would foster both, through research that is related to CSR, and also through vast other research that is not related to CSR and is not labeled as being part of CSR. And I think also with the understanding of the notion of corporate social responsibility, we have moved away from the strict interpretation of the term, rather towards an understanding that this is a part of a bigger picture related, as I said, both to supporting and fostering sustainability in the society and in business, and in business as part of society, and also responsibility. So the next program, as you mentioned, and as I mentioned earlier, it will have an even more reinforced focus on sustainability, as the program itself is driven by the need to address societal challenges. So many of the societal challenges are right now related to sustainability, understood in a broad way. So certainly there will be, I think there will be more possibilities in the next program to address those issues in a more comprehensive way, and to also move away from the strict interpretation of the notion of CSR, as we have also done towards the end of this framework program, the seventh framework program, where we already try to grasp a broader scope. Now, I would like to also mention one thing at operational level, at the framework program level, so the research program level. We have also developed a concept of responsible research and innovation, which is incorporated into Horizon 2020. It is a concept that the research that we do and the innovations that we do need to be responsible in a certain way. Here we understand this responsible research and innovation is understood through basically 6 dimensions. And first of all, it's stakeholder involvement. So involvement of all types of stakeholders, business, non-business, civil society, trade unions, all this. So all relevant stakeholders should be involved in the research process and should be involved in the innovation process. Second of all, and there is a long policy background to that, is to have the gender dimension properly incorporated into research. Then to have open access to research results, because if research is funded from public money, there should be open access to it. Another thing is to foster science education, to foster ethics in research, and finally to provide a sufficient governance framework to actually ensure that this concept of responsible research and innovation really takes place and is operationalized within the framework program. So this is what we do from the perspective of responsibility in the research agenda setting, and in the way we envisage research to be done under the new framework program.
Good. Okay. I have another question for you, because I just looked at one of the statements here. There is no convincing evidence from the study that the business response to European Commission policy goals are moving in the direction that the European Commission would hope. Meaning, business doesn't care about your policy goals. How will you, in the Commission, ensure that business is more aligned, or that you are more aligned with business in terms of your policy objectives?
Well, I think that's a very harsh
I'm sorry.
statement.
He was not prepared for it.
I actually think it's not true. But I would say that if business doesn't care about European Commission policy goals, that's maybe better, because that means that we are a bit invisible. And I think that regulators are much better if they are a bit invisible.
That's it.
And still things are going in the right direction. So I think that what we can say is that over the years we have seen that business has started caring much more about sustainability issues. I mean, these are also major policy goals of not only the European Commission, but generally of the countries in Europe, and also of societies in Europe. I think as society, we want to be in Europe, as society in Europe, we want to be more sustainable, and business is a part of it, and business has also developed a better understanding and also a better, stronger willingness to try to go in this direction in many different ways that are possible. So I think that this quote was a bit too restrictive in understanding what are the policy goals. Possibly if this is related to CSR policy, that might be true, but we have also, CSR policy was conceived, as I said, in a quite restrictive way, also because there was no agreement of business to actually have it as a broader issue, that as a broader concept. So it was established also in cooperation with business to see what is feasible. If it then CSR policy goals have a limited impact on business, that's possible. We are also, in terms of policy, we are also moving away from the strict concept of CSR. There have been many activities over the recent years, many policy initiatives over the recent years that are related to CSR but do not have the CSR label, and that try to take business on board, because of course if business is not on board, it will not lead anywhere.
Yeah, so getting business on board is the key, and involving them in identifying the major policy areas is maybe a way forward, also to draw their attention to some of the pressing needs in European societies, which policymakers on their own cannot respond to adequately and need business to help them. But there is a gap there in terms of business alignment. Jeremy, policy relevant research for the future. What is your view?
Just a few points. In part of the project, quite early on, we actually did a study of national policies for CSR within the EU members. And I was been rereading that and sort of come up with an observation that there's quite a lot of variation in these policies, broadly defined, in terms of the extent to which governments want to use CSR-type thinking across a wide range of their activities, be it from employment, environment, international trade, human rights, but also in the sort of depth of approach. So in some cases, governments are using endorsement, relatively modest organizational or financial incentives, but in other cases, more deep-seated approaches which extend to partnerships of the sort that we've been hearing about this morning, and even mandates the use of soft rules. So I think one obvious area of research is actually looking at how and why governments are engaging with CSR thinking, but also how they build in impact thinking into the way they devise this quite a wide range of uses of CSR for policies for their own sake. It seems to me, apropos of the conversation you've just been having, that the legitimacy of the EU manifestly must be that the EU can translate societal expectations in a way that business can find helpful, so that the businesses can respond to society's expectations about sustainability. And that's a fairly obvious point in democratic politics, but it perhaps bears remembering in this case. And the general points I made about co-accountability and co-production, I think, should be central here, and so that initiatives, be it around nudging the reporting systems up a bit, need to reflect that. I think also that, understandably, a number of regulators have thought to support business in being more socially responsible, addressing either a national or a European competitiveness argument or an individual business case. But quite often, these initiatives also provide another business case service around collective action problems. And actually, a lot of businesses, I think, are reasonably anxious about, if we do this, what costs are we putting in and others aren't. Quite a few of these initiatives can quite simply help address those. I think of the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative. For all its limitations, it makes it clear to extractive companies what's expected in terms of revealing various payments to governments. And I think the same could be built into thinking about the costs of reporting and making reporting easy and adding value to companies. I think that's my lot.
Thank you. Nigel, policy relevance.
Yeah, I think the comments that I made earlier on may be seen in different ways by different people. Let me remind you, we started with a policy question which led to the call that we responded to. We started as a group of 17 universities, business schools and others with some views on that. We came together to refine that. We developed and grew, and we're reporting the results. So there's a very long story behind where we started and where we ended up. Many hours of discussion, and I think all 17 individuals and more in the group will have a different view of the story that we went through. Research of the kind we've just done is not neat and tidy, but I think the policy question that informed it is an important one to remember. We as a commission have been doing, not me as a commission, we as a commission have been doing CSR and promoting CSR for 10 years. So what are its impacts? I mean, that's a pretty profound question, and we tried to address that in our study. The question, I think, is what are the policy questions into the future? What are the policy questions for the Commission in the future? And we heard it from Dominic. Are we moving in the direction of a more sustainable society and economy? Maybe this is not what our European society expects, but I have to say, I think they need it. Maybe it's not where business wants to go, because it's a difficult way to make business. It's much more complex than just making money. To be competitive within a sustainable economy and society is very difficult. I think that's the policy question, and that's why we have this other debate, which is about transformation of business and new business models and new partnerships, as well as the discussion we're having about impacts. What we have to have is a less impactful society in the next 20 years.
Less impact society.
Less impactful society, including business. Business is part of society. So we have to have a less impactful society because if you look at the reports of the planetary demands, carrying capacity,
Right.
we simply don't have enough planets to keep us living in the society. We over-impact it, so by definition we have to reduce its impacts. So the policy question, I think, is quite obvious. It's about transformative change. I don't think many people want to do that. I'm not sure that many people know how to do it. So what I'd suggest is that one of the focuses for policy-relevant research is to look at those organizations that have managed to accomplish something of the right direction of transformation. Don't study the self-publicist organizations. Don't study the organizations with the greenwash. Don't study the organizations that aren't actually doing anything, they're just talking about it. Study the companies and the partnerships and the collaborations that are creating effective change, which is somehow reducing their impacts.
Okay.
Because they are the future if we are to have one.
Thank you very much. I open it up now for your comments, please. Policy relevance of future research. We heard two perspectives, a perspective from Jeremy, responding to societal expectations. Nigel saying, well, there has to be more than societal expectations. There's the future of the planet. There's total impact of not just business, but also consumers. The whole impact is subject to analysis and research. Comments from you, please. Yes, please. By the way, may I ask how many of the 18 or 17 companies that were subject to a case study in the research are present here? Okay, so at least 3. The question is, where are the others? And so how many representatives from business are here? Total numbers. Okay, 1, 2, okay. All right, sir.
Two small comments. One, I think, related to the more global aspects, I think the policy/research projects should be bridged with other continents, not just European, because otherwise they will have no effect. Second, I think a lot of the policy instruments that the Commission is developing in effect should be sector specific or should be what I would call, I don't know how companies call this, but they should follow a chain of supply, company and the consumer leg. Because if they don't, the impacts are in a way fairly meaningless. Because if you do something at the company level, well, it has a repercussion on the supply and maybe also on the consumer side. So doing it in that chain is helpful, I think.
Good.
That's all I wanted to say.
So more sector-specific research. Again, it's a level of analysis at sector level and also at regional level, which was, Michel raised yesterday and today. Yes, please. Now, the other thing that I want to mention is, which Dominic has not mentioned, what clearly was said yesterday is that research will be more global. You heard that yesterday. And also institutions like Harvard, can benefit from EU research funding. And that's probably the reason you're sitting here.
And European research knowledge, I would suggest.
Yes.
Harvard could benefit from that, as Americans could.
Yes, okay, we know.
Sorry, did I say something?
Yes, you did.
Okay.
I heartily agree.
So this is, it is to be understood, because that's what I understood yesterday, because in the past we had difficulties in including some of the non-European universities and business schools. And some were explicitly excluded, like the Americans, right? So there will be more room for that. Is that correct?
Not entirely correct. Also in the also in terms of interpretation of the past, because first of all institutions from all over the world were always eligible to participate in European-funded projects. Now the question was the funding. And then in some specific cases, European funding was possible, even for the most advanced economically countries like the US. And the US was only one of 5, I think, exceptions in the world where the funding from European resources was difficult. And it was US, in 7th Framework Program, for example, it was US, Canada, Australia, Japan, and I think one more. All the other countries are always fully eligible to get European funding, and also in some specific cases, institutions from those high-income countries were also eligible. Now, what I actually heard about Horizon 2020 is that more countries will be not excluded, but with more countries it will be difficult to get European funding. For example, as far as I know, China and Brazil are among those countries that will not be fully eligible to get European funding, only in specific cases. So this one would need to look, will need to look carefully at the final shape of regulation on the framework program. This is not out yet. These regulations have not been adopted yet, also rules of participation, because that's the key document, and really see what are exactly the provisions, the legal provisions for obtaining funding by non-European based institutions.
Thank you for that clarification. But so there's a difference between the outlook of the research, which will be more global, although the funding is a different matter. Yes, madam.
So I have a question really that I appreciate responses from anybody who has more insight into EU policy making than I do. My thinking is around, clearly this should be an international initiative, as Vincent alluded to. There should be cooperation with other governments, but as we know, some governments will not be as amenable to the EU policies on corporate social responsibility, environmental conservation, human rights, et cetera. So my question is, in terms of EU policy making, around corporate requirements for corporate social responsibility, corporate impact, et cetera, what do any of you see as the opportunities to influence corporate practice in other countries? I'm particularly thinking of the United States, because it's unlikely that the US government is going to start imposing similar expectations, reporting expectations, impact measurements. So where do you see the opportunities for EU policy to then influence foreign corporations?
On a more global level.
On a global
Okay.
level,
We'll
sort of
keep that question.
bypassing government
We'll
action.
keep that question for the debate. So any other comments or statements to be made on how to get future EU-funded research more policy relevant? Simon.
Well, again, it's sort of bridging between the two. For the inclusion of business, how policy can really incentivize business to get involved in research.
No, the question
The outputs, but the outputs are in part the products, what we can use practically, but also a learning experience. I think companies are more inclined to get involved in research projects if there are opportunities to experiment or be involved in incubators. It's what they do. It's called product and service development. And I think if that is encouraged within the broader context of Horizon 2020, then companies will see more benefit of actually engaging. Right, so it's not just as objects of study. And the last one I come back to is also on the futures, because we have a big project that starts in January on sustainable lifestyles to 2050. And I think the expertise in academia to bring to modeling and scenarios development and providing scientific models to test those is something that we haven't seen enough of, but I think it's an untapped seam of value for policy thinking and also the relevance of outputs from research, looking into the future.
Thank you, Simon. More comments from the floor? Yes, please. Andre.
Well, when we talk about research and policy making, then I think it's about knowledge brokerage between two parts of society. And we carried out several projects, also funded by the Commission, just on knowledge brokerage, and we saw that there are two types how research can be more policy relevant. Either it's more evidence-based policy making, so this means that policy asks for evidence either before implementing policies or after implementing them. It's about impact assessment, it's about agenda setting, it's about evaluation. So the definition of the problem comes from policy making, and researchers produce evidence. The other extreme point is to question the framing of policy making, what researchers always like to do. So that the framing of policy making is not taken as a given, but it's questioned. And I think for CSR research, this question of the framing is the much more interesting one. And there's a framing that I would like to question, which is the shift in policy perception from sustainable development to green growth. Because right now, to green growth.
Okay.
Green growth is the big new term. Sustainability loses importance, dramatically loses importance. On European level, the European Sustainable Development Strategy is just given up. It's the Europe 2020 strategy. Even at the Commission, sustainable development units are dismantled, and the experts are shifted to technology-oriented units. So there is no longer dealing with well-being, dealing with growth debates and so on. It's about how to implement green growth. It's a very technocratic approach. Will this have some consequences for CSR research as well?
Okay, thank you. The question from the lady from America, Dominic. I mean, the issue clearly is Europe is not alone in the world, but it is the biggest trading partner in the world. Europe is the biggest trading partner in the world. Okay, let's not forget that. Not say, well, we're just Europe, you know, there is America's much bigger. No, Europe is the biggest trading partner in the world. But there is China, and there is the United States. And we know, I mean, 10 years ago, there was research in the impact assessment of trade agreements. It was a big program in the EU. And I was part of the academic committee, and this was 12 years ago. It lasted only 2 years, and then it was disbanded because there was no policy conclusions that could be drawn from that. And there was internal resistance because it would put Europe at a disadvantage against America and against China if we would, you know, impose sustainability standards on trade agreements, right? And it was disbanded, right? And now we have, of course, the whole issues in the supply chain, in the clothing industry and so on, which were then already announced that they would take place, and this was an attempt to. So 12 years ago, we had research, and indeed we had some policy initiatives on sustainability assessment of trade agreements. It was disbanded. 12 years later, we come back to the same question. You know, if we really want to manage impacts, you know, this is a global question. It's not just a European question. So how can research help advance the responses to these global questions instead of just the European questions? Dominic.
Well, this is a very difficult question. First, I would like to refer to some other points that were made, more specific, then I will go to this more global level. First of all, on sector-specific policies, and that was indeed done. I don't know to what exactly effect, but a couple of years ago within DG, Directorate General for Enterprise and Industry, there were initiatives that were kind of spin-offs from the CSR, or that originated in the CSR family, let's put it like this, to see what kind of sectoral initiatives that would be sector-specific could be organized. And there were some discussions with stakeholders and business. I don't know exactly how this has ended, but there were initiatives. There is an awareness that you can have a lot of impact at the sectoral level addressing sector-specific issues with policies. Second of all, the pledge to go beyond Europe, that's exactly what we are doing right now, for example, with the new program starting, with new research project starting next year. We explicitly wanted to go beyond Europe, so we engage scientific partners and companies working on other continents. And there will be further opportunities under Horizon 2020 as well for this. In terms of application for business, a question from Simon that you can get business more on board, where there are some practical benefits for business. I think that what is an important policy shift is that in research policy is that in Horizon 2020 program, the types of action through which we are going to implement most of the research funding is through research and innovation action as one type, and through innovation action as the second type. And this will substitute what we have now as collaborative projects, etc. So there is this idea that with every activities that we fund, there is scope for innovation, which means also very much research that can be applied in practice. So I think that there will be even more room for that in the next program to really produce something which is practically usable as a part of the research project. Okay. Now, to this, responding a bit to your question, well, I think that certainly the EU has an important leverage globally, but there are smaller partners and bigger partners. So as far as I know, in various agreements that also relate to trade, but there are also other cooperation agreements with much smaller partners, Europe is able to insert certain provisions in those agreements to support sustainability. Now, obviously, the main difficulties are the discussions at the global level with the biggest global partners, which are a bit more reluctant than Europe to take this step forward towards green growth or sustainability, or basically in the direction we are talking about here all the time. And there I think, well, first of all, we should try also at the policy level, and I think here dialogue is needed. It's ongoing and it goes in different ways. But also a lot can be done underneath this at a lower level by collaboration. For example, a lot that we do with China happens at the lower level without a higher policy level, because then the ideas are rejected. But a lot can be done on the ground by working together, and in this way spreading certain style of thinking by showing what are the implications, what are the benefits of looking in a more sustainable way at certain issues. So I think that as long as, when it is not possible to be done at the highest policy level, one should collaborate at the lower level, because one will find a lot of people that are willing to do this all over the world in every country.
Okay, I need to move on. Yeah, I'll come to you and Nigel, and let's include your comments on implications for management education of what we've been discussing this morning in the same response. You each get 1 minute.
Is that me?
Yes, please.
So I don't underestimate the impact of European society internationally. The fair trade movement has actually been quite a niche opportunity, and it's actually something that coming back to the question about what new research strategies, we've got a PhD student who's looking at the impact of fair trade in agricultural product areas and the value that's created for workers in the fields, she's interviewed them, for people in the manufacturing, for people in the offices, so then doing the marketing and distribution, impact particularly on gender as it happens. So I think that's, going back to the first question, a focus on value. Number two, of course, governments have got interested in the fair trade thing too. And we have ethical trade initiatives from a number of governments. The Scandinavian ethical trade initiatives at the moment are leaning very hard on the Bangladesh government. Paradoxical, it's a sort of an idea which is a CSR one. Governments have taken it up, but still it's empowered by CSR, by NGOs, trade unions, companies, and now they're putting pressure on a Bangladeshi government. More pessimistically, I'm aware that this sort of thing happened vis-à-vis the Vietnamese government. Companies were anxious about pilfering and extortion in transport industries through the ports in Vietnam. They came up with an agreement with the government. The problem is the wages of the workers were still so modest that the Vietnamese government alone was not able to change the practices entirely. And co-production of research internationally, just to elaborate on Andre's point, Andre Martinuzzi is the leader of this new research project, and we're working with co-researchers in Bangladesh, India, Tanzania, at least. Oh, on education. Yeah. CSR and professionalization. We found in the financial crisis the CSR sections of these companies didn't understand the business models. That's number one for education about CSR and sustainability. Make sure they understand the models. Number two, connect the CSR much more with sustainability. And at Nottingham, we try to bring in much more experiential learning around this. And we find our executives really like it. And finally, about 30 or 40 years ago, Jensen and others smuggled in the ancient principle theory. This is a fraud on corporate governance, but it's been a fabulous success. It's influenced the way business schools teach business, and it is fits poorly with everything we know about corporate governance everywhere in the world, including America. So let's be brave and try and think about the paradigms.
Right. I have observations at two levels. One is about the global issues that we were discussing very quickly, and also about education. What does this mean for education? At the global level, America, Europe, China are not the same thing, but they all are part of the same problematique, which is how do we succeed and how do we survive? That's what unites us, even though we have different interpretations. We need a far better interpenetration of ideas to learn from different perspectives than the ones that we find fit so well with our origins. And I'm reminded that the initial successful work of the International Panel on Climate Change, the convergence of opinion among scientists, caused there to be the International Human Dimensions Panel that was created. Now, 12 years ago, I was privileged to be involved in that, but that got lost. Somehow the idea that international human dimensions scientists might come together to work with international policy making, supra EU and National Science Foundation in America, supra that level, to look at some of these global issues, despite the differences of perspective that different regional areas might have on them, was very important. Somehow that got lost. I would welcome it coming back as long as it didn't just create an elite. Education. We should never forget that as business academics, we are educators, not researchers, but educators and researchers. So our research should be relevant to education because we are there to help the process of change that is necessary in order to continue to survive in a changing world. And the biggest challenge we have is that we have to collapse the research cycle between developing new knowledge and communicating that to our students. We need to be much quicker than we have been. It was a cycle of about 10 years. You develop some research, you translate it into some education, it gets into the classroom. Normally 8 to 10 years. Nowadays it's going to have to be much quicker because the world is changing so quickly. So we'll have to do concurrent research education, and it's going to be much less conformed. It's going to be more ragged and uneven than it ever was before. And I focus on it. We have to focus much more on know-how, knowing how to do it well. knowing how to do it better. Not just knowledge. I don't want to have, if you want to teach what does Kant's categorical imperative have to tell us about corporate responsibility, if you want to teach your students that, you can. I want to teach them how to do this well.
Knowledge for action. Thank you, Nigel. Thank you, Jeremy. Thank you, Dominic. And thank you for your patience and your contribution. Simon, over to you. And an applause for our panel.